Steve Harvey dropped the microphone. He stepped down from the stage. And what he did next turned into a moment where no one in the studio could hold back their tears. The lights were bright. The cameras were rolling. Family Feud was in full swing, just another Tuesday afternoon taping at the studio in Atlanta. Two families faced each other across the iconic blue and red podiums, buzzers ready, smiles wide. Steve Harvey, in his signature three-piece suit, was doing what he does best, cracking jokes, reading questions, keeping the energy high. But then something shifted. Something in the air changed. Steve stopped mid-sentence. His smile faded. The entire studio went silent. What happened next wasn't scripted. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, real, and it reminded everyone watching why Steve Harvey isn't just a host. He's human. And on this day, that humanity broke through every rule of television. Steve stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The Johnson family had just won the first round. Applause filled the room. Steve walked over to congratulate them, shaking hands, exchanging high fives. That's when he noticed her. Linda Johnson. A woman in her mid-40s, standing at the end of the podium. She was smiling, but her eyes told a different story. They were red. Swollen. The kind of eyes that come from months of crying. Steve paused. He looked at her for a moment longer than usual. Then he did something producers never expect. He went off script. "Hold on," Steve said, raising his hand to pause the game. "Hold on just a second." The other family looked confused. The audience murmured. The producers in the control room leaned forward. "Steve Harvey never stops the game. Not like this." Steve turned to Linda. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice stripped of all humor. "Are you okay?" Linda tried to smile. She nodded. But her lip trembled. And Steve saw it. "No," Steve said gently. "No, you're not. And that's okay. Talk to me." The cameras kept rolling, but it didn't feel like a show anymore. It felt like a conversation. A real one. Linda took a breath. Her husband, standing beside her, squeezed her hand. Her teenage daughter, positioned at the next podium spot, looked down, tears already forming. "My son," Linda began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My son, Tyler. He's not here today." Steve's jaw tightened. He knew. Before she said another word, he knew. "He passed away 3 months ago," Linda continued, her voice cracking. "He was 14. He had leukemia. He fought so hard. And his dream, his one dream before he got too sick, was to be on this show. With us. As a family." The studio was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock. The kind that comes from collective heartbreak. Steve Harvey, the man who has hosted thousands of episodes, who has seen countless families, who has heard every kind of story, stood completely still. His eyes filled with tears. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Linda wasn't finished. "We applied 2 years ago," she said, wiping her eyes. "Tyler was so excited. But then he got sick. Really sick. And we thought we'd never get the call. But we did. 3 weeks after his funeral, we got the call. And I almost didn't come. I almost said no. But my daughter, my husband, my mother-in-law, they said Tyler would want us here. So here we are. Playing for him." Steve Harvey dropped his head. His shoulders shook. The man who makes millions laugh was crying on national television. He walked toward Linda. Not as a host. As a human being. He reached out, and Linda collapsed into his arms. The two stood there, in the middle of the Family Feud stage, holding each other as the weight of grief filled the room. The audience was silent. Then, slowly, one person stood. Then another. Then the entire studio was on its feet, not applauding, just standing in solidarity. Even the opposing families stepped out from behind their podium, hands over their hearts. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. After a few moments, Steve pulled back, holding Linda by the shoulders. He looked her in the eyes. "We're gonna play this game," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And we're gonna play it for Tyler. You hear me?" Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. Steve turned to the crew. "Stop the clock," he said. "I don't care. Stop it." Producers scrambled. This wasn't protocol. Shows don't stop. Schedules don't pause. But Steve Harvey had made a choice, and no one was going to challenge him. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a card. His personal card. He handed it to Linda. "You call me," he said. "Anytime. I mean that. You need anything at all, you call me." Linda clutched the card like it was a lifeline. But Steve wasn't done. He turned to the audience. "How many of y'all have lost someone?" he asked, his voice raw. Hands went up all over the studio. Dozens of them. "Then you know," Steve said. "You know what it's like to keep going when everything in you wants to stop. And this woman right here? She showed up. That takes courage." The applause was thunderous now. Not the polite, game show kind. The real kind. The kind that says, "We see you. We feel you." Steve looked back at the crew. "All right," he said, composing himself. "Let's play. For Tyler." The game resumed, but it was different. Every answer Linda's family gave was met with roaring applause. Every point they scored felt like a victory not just for them, but for everyone who had ever loved and lost. The other family, the Davidsons, played with respect and grace, cheering the Johnsons on even when they were losing. By the end of the round, the Johnsons had won. But it didn't feel like a competition anymore. It felt like a tribute. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. After the cameras stopped rolling for the commercial break, Steve didn't walk back to his podium. He walked over to the Johnson family's elderly grandmother, who had been sitting quietly in the family section. She was Tyler's grandmother. Steve knelt down in front of her. "Ma'am," he said softly, taking her hand. "I'm so sorry for your loss." The grandmother, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes, looked at Steve. "He loved you," she said, her voice shaking. "He used to watch you every day. You made him laugh even when he was in so much pain." Steve's face crumpled. He pressed her hand to his forehead and wept. Camera operators, producers, audience members, everyone was crying now. This wasn't television anymore. This was life. Raw. Unfiltered. Beautiful in its brokenness. When Steve finally stood, he did something no one expected. He took off his jacket. The same navy blue jacket he'd been wearing all episode. The jacket that was part of his signature look. He draped it over the grandmother's shoulders. "You keep this," he said. "And you remember that Tyler's love is still here. It's in you. It's in your daughter. It's in your family. And now it's in this jacket. You carry it with you." The grandmother clutched the jacket, sobbing into the fabric. Linda wrapped her arms around her mother. The daughter joined them. The husband stood behind, his hand on his wife's back. And Steve Harvey, standing in his vest and tie, watched them with tears streaming down his face. The studio erupted. Not in applause this time, but in something deeper. A collective release. People were hugging strangers. Crew members were wiping their eyes. Even the Davidsons, the opposing family, had joined the Johnsons on stage, creating a circle of support around them. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the episode wrapped, Steve didn't leave. He stayed for over an hour, talking to the Johnsons, taking photos, signing autographs for the audience. But more than that, he listened. He sat with Linda and her family in the green room and let them talk about Tyler. About his love for basketball. About his sense of humor. About the way he'd light up a room. Steve didn't try to fix anything. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just sat. And listened. And that, more than anything, was what the family needed. Months later, Linda shared on social media that Steve had kept his promise. He called her. Not once, but several times. He checked in on her family. He sent flowers on Tyler's birthday. And when her daughter graduated high school, Steve sent a video message congratulating her and reminding her that her brother was proud. The episode eventually aired, and it became one of the most watched Family Feud episodes in history. Not because of the game. Not because of the prizes. But because of the moment. The moment Steve Harvey stopped being a host and became a human being who saw another human being in pain and chose to stop everything to honor that pain. Steve later said in an interview that the episode changed him. "You do this job long enough, you can forget," he admitted. "You forget that behind every contestant, every family, there's a real story. Real pain. Real joy. Real life. That day reminded me why I do this. It's not about the laughs. It's not about the ratings. It's about connection. It's about showing up for people when they need it most." The jacket Steve gave to Tyler's grandmother still hangs in their living room. Linda says it's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there are people who care. People who see you. People who will stop the world, even for just a moment, to hold space for your grief. And that's the legacy of Steve Harvey. Not the jokes. Not the suits. Not the fame. It's the moments when he chooses humanity over entertainment. When he breaks protocol to honor pain. When he reminds us all that at the end of the day, we're not just players in a game. We're people. And people deserve to be seen. That day on the Family Feud stage, Steve Harvey didn't just host a show. He held space for a family's grief. He honored a boy's memory. And he reminded an entire studio, and millions of viewers, that compassion is the most powerful thing we can offer each other. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe. And leave a comment telling us about a moment when someone showed up for you in your darkest hour. Because stories like this don't just deserve to be told. They deserve to be remembered. The ripple effect of that day went far beyond the Johnson family. In the weeks following the episode's airing, the show received thousands of letters. Messages from parents who had lost children. From grandparents holding on to memories. From siblings navigating grief. Each one echoed the same sentiment: thank you for showing us that it's okay to break down. Thank you for proving that vulnerability isn't weakness. Thank you for reminding us that we're not alone. One letter came from a mother in Ohio. Her daughter had died in a car accident 6 months prior, and she hadn't left the house since. She wrote that watching Steve stop everything to honor Tyler's memory gave her the courage to finally step outside. To breathe again. To believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way forward. Another came from a young man in Texas who had been contemplating ending his own life. He said that seeing Steve's tears, seeing his willingness to be vulnerable in front of millions, made him realize that strength isn't about holding everything together. It's about allowing yourself to fall apart when you need to. He's still here because of that realization. Steve read every single letter. He kept them in a folder in his office labeled Tyler. And on days when the pressure of fame felt too heavy, when the demands of the industry threatened to harden him, he'd open that folder and remember why he does what he does. The jacket that now hangs in the Johnsons' living room has become something of a symbol in their community. Friends and neighbors know the story. And when they visit, they don't just see a piece of clothing. They see proof that kindness exists. That empathy is real. That even in a world that often feels cold and transactional, there are people who will stop, listen, and care. Tyler's sister, now in college, wrote her entrance essay about that day. About watching her mother break down on national television. About witnessing Steve Harvey choose humanity over entertainment. About learning that grief doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. She got accepted into every school she applied to. And she credits that essay, and that moment, with changing the trajectory of her life. Steve Harvey's career has spanned decades. He's won awards. Hosted massive events. Built an empire. But when interviewers ask him about his proudest moment, he doesn't talk about ratings or accolades. He talks about Linda. About Tyler. About the day he chose to stop the show and honor a family's pain. "That's what I want to be remembered for," he said in a recent interview. "Not the jokes. Not the money. I want to be remembered as someone who saw people. Really saw them. And who wasn't afraid to meet them where they were." And that's exactly what happened on that Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta. Steve Harvey saw a woman drowning in grief. And instead of looking away, instead of staying in his role as host, he dove in. He got messy. He broke the rules. And in doing so, he gave Linda, her family, and millions of viewers permission to do the same. Because that's what real leadership looks like. It's not about having all the answers. It's not about being perfect or polished. It's about showing up. It's about being present. It's about choosing compassion over comfort. And Steve Harvey, in that moment, was the embodiment of all three.